Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Jackson School of International Studies. I'm Director Leila Fernandez, and I'm delighted to invite you to our inaugural event for the year as part of our Jackson School Speaker Series. I'd like to begin today's event with the Jackson School land acknowledgement. The Jackson School acknowledges that we are on Coast Salish territory, the traditional homelands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and other indigenous peoples. The Jackson School understands that the international community includes sovereign American Indian tribes, First Nations, and indigenous peoples across the world. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event, sponsored by the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies in partnership with the East Asia Center, China Studies Program, and the Center for Global Studies at the University of Washington. We're extremely privileged today to have a distinguished speaker, Congressman Adam Smith of Washington's 9th Congressional District. He is a senior member of the House of Representatives in the US Congress and serves as chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. Given his current and previous committee assignments and extensive travel, Congressman Smith has unique insights into today's major national security issues throughout the Middle East, including the war in Afghanistan, as well as Northern Africa, and efforts to stop the spread of violent extremist groups and their ideology around the globe. Understanding the need for a holistic approach to national security, Representative Smith recognizes the importance of poverty reduction, access to education, sustainable global markets, diplomatic engagement, good governance, and other measures to enable our pursuit of stable international partners. As such, he has been a longtime advocate of strengthening American diplomacy and development, as well as defense. Representative Smith today will be engaging us in a conversation about China. What I'd like to invite the audience to do as Congressman Smith is speaking is to put your questions in the Q&A space because this will be mostly an interactive session. I would like to also remind you that the University of Washington is a nonpartisan institution, and I'd like you to ask the audience to respectfully stay focused on the substance of the comments that Representative Smith will make and the theme of today's discussion. With that, I'd like to welcome you, Representative Smith, to speak. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And I really want to thank the Jackson School for organizing this event in the first place. And second of all, for the outstanding work you do at the University of Washington and in our community. I've had the privilege to work with the school for a number of years, taught the task force for a few years there when the schedule permitted. And you just do an excellent job of not just obviously educating students in our community, but you also play a crucial role in informing policymakers and leading the discussion on how we should handle some of the most important foreign policy challenges that we face as a country. So I appreciate that. It's always an honor and a privilege to be with you. And I look forward to this discussion. It's an incredibly interesting time, obviously, in US politics, global politics as well. And the overarching theme in terms of our US foreign policy is that sort of pivot and change. With the Biden administration coming in, we obviously have a significant change from what the Trump administration had done, but they're developing that. And the transition was very slow for a variety of different reasons. We're just now appointing ambassadors, getting the key positions in place in the executive branch. So the next 6 months to 1 year are going to be really critical in determining what is the Biden administration's position on global affairs. In the short term, not only has the transition been slow, but obviously we've been very focused on COVID, on dealing with the pandemic, which obviously has some international implications, but has been a domestic focus. And now, as you all have seen, somewhat painfully, the broader discussion of our infrastructure packages and how they move forward. But behind the scenes on all of that, a lot is going on in terms of the Pentagon, national security team getting in place and trying to say, what is the Biden foreign policy going to be? They are redoing the national defense strategy right now. They're also redoing the nuclear posture review. All of that is going to have a profound impact on what our role in the world is for at least the next three plus years during the Biden administration. And at the center of that really is China. Now, on the Armed Services Committee, and I've wanted to come up with a mnemonic for this for a while, but I haven't. It's China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, transnational terrorist groups. When we talk about what our national security threats are, those are the 5 things that we list out. And they are all important in their own way as we try to figure out how to be strategically present in the world. But China is above all of them. If you want to think of the next 100 years and what the world is going to be like, few things are going to impact that more than how China and the US get along or don't get along in global affairs. Certainly climate change is going to have a more profound impact, but that too is going to be driven much by the relationship between the US and China. We are the 2 undeniable powers in the world. To an extent that it's been a while since you've had 2 countries so clearly above everybody else and with the level of power that we have. Yes, we had the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union never had the economic power that the US had. Obviously, China's economic power is rising by the day. Their military power is rising as well. Diplomatically, they are present everywhere. As I've traveled the world throughout Africa, Asia, Middle East, you don't go anywhere without running into China's presence in the same way that you don't go anywhere without running into the US presence. Well, I don't, of course, because wherever I am, that is part of the US presence. But it is really happening to a pace that 20 years ago would have been unimaginable. China is actively engaging in global affairs to a very aggressive level. And we're out there too. So how are we going to get along? So that's the first point. Second point is I am really alarmed at the current state of that discussion. There is an enormous amount of anti-China paranoia that is permeating throughout public policy circles, certainly in the government. Now, a lot of this is certainly coming from the right and from the Republicans, but there are a number of Democrats who are as adamant about the threat that China poses. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not unaware of the threat that China poses, but we have to get along in this world. And this is something that I've been really worried about, not just between us and China, but in general, people seem to increasingly think that I don't like that person. I don't like that group. I don't like what they're doing. Let's figure out some way to crush them and get them out of our way. That's not actually the way human beings should interact with each other. We have to find a way to coexist. China's not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere. So how are we going to peacefully coexist in the world? And right now, so much of the rhetoric on both sides, frankly, I met with the Chinese ambassador just a week and a half ago in my office back in DC, and he was somewhat strident about his concerns about what America was doing. So there is as much rhetoric coming out of China about how bad the US is as there is in the US coming out about how bad China is. And that is dangerous if we don't figure out a way to get along, because we are 2 nuclear powers, 2 military powers. Conflict would be catastrophic between the 2 of us wherever it took place. Now, again, that's not an argument for saying that we should step back, let China do whatever they want to do, but understand the fact that we are better off if we find a way to get along for the 2 of us. But also, the countries around us are incredibly nervous about it as well. I always remember I was in Singapore for the Shangri-La dialogues a couple of years ago, and the president of Singapore was speaking, as he put it, when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. And that means every other country around there. So keep that in mind. And with all of that in mind, I mean, there's 3 basic approaches that we need to take when it comes to dealing with China. In my sphere as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, now, as was mentioned in the intro, I don't just deal with the military. I'm very interested in diplomacy and development and partnerships and alliances as well. But in the military sphere, what I'm trying to push is the idea of deterrence. And that competes with the idea that seems to be, dominant in the military world. Then that idea is dominance, that basically the US military must be large enough and strong enough to dominate China. I don't think, A, that's going to happen. The nature of warfare is such that it's a lot more difficult to dominate people now than it used to be. B, China's got some economic power and they're going to be moving forward. But C, it also sort of leads to conflict. When you think that you're heading into an encounter and you're going to try to dominate it, the other side is unlikely to view that in a positive way. So deterrence is the way I prefer to think about it. And deterrence here is to try to get China to work within a rules-based international order and to not be aggressive militarily. And there, it does matter how strong the US is. And it is not easy to overstate the degree to which China has pushed those boundaries. We're all very much aware of their increasing belligerence towards Taiwan. They've been flying more and more fighter airplanes very, very close to Taiwan. Their rhetoric has become more and more bellicose. We've certainly seen what happened in Hong Kong, where, one country, two systems did not play out. They've been suppressing folks there, suppressing the Uyghur population. They've been grabbing territory that is at best disputed, and in many cases, the clear territory of many of their neighbors in South Asia. They are also, and this is not as widely reported, very aggressively violating fishing rights of countries all around the globe, not just in Asia. Using their power to grab more resources and not live within the bounds and rules of society. We need to be able to deter them. If they start thinking that they can do anything they want unchecked, that is a problem. And I do want to take just one moment to explain what I mean by deterrence. So they did a whole bunch of war games. The Office of Net Assessment at the Pentagon did a bunch of war games over about 5 or 6 years in the late 2010s. And basically what they concluded was, if the scenario is if China tries to take Taiwan, we try to stop them, we get in a fight. It was not good, basically, and mainly because our systems were too stationary, too clustered together, too easily targeted. Our information systems could easily be taken down. Our satellites could easily be taken down. And so we struggled with this, and it kind of freaked out the military community for quite some time. Well, they did another war game. This was done by the Air Force this time, about 1.5 years ago, in which they said, well, what if the US had different systems? What if we had better drone technology? What if our forces were more distributed? What if we had the NGAD? Sorry, it's a new jet fighter that's coming online that's more stealthy. What if we did all of that? And they set it up. And the red team, which basically is the guys who play China for the purposes of the war game, looked at the game board as it was laid out, and they said, yeah, no, we don't want to do this. At which point the people organizing it said, well, that's tough, because the point of this is to have the fight, so you're going to do it because we're trying to go through it. But that is the key. That is the very definition of deterrence. We want China to look at the game board, as it were, and say, we're not going to have that fight. So that is what I mean by deterrence, so that we can get past the notion that they think they can use their military to bully their way through to achieve their ends. The second major concept, and this has just come out of the Biden administration, started talking about it, but it's been out there for a while, strategic competition. We are going to compete with China, particularly economically. And that's okay, actually, in my view. A, I believe in competition. Competition makes everybody better. And B, China is a fact of life. And what a lot of people forget about the United States when we are lamenting the fact that we are no longer the global dominant power is our dominance was something of an accident of history. Certainly, we played a role in it. But at the end of World War II, and I love this stat, 1948, the United States of America was responsible for 90% of global manufacturing. Think about that for a second. 90% of global manufacturing, 4% of the population. And the reason for that, of course, was that the entire industrialized world had just been blown off the face of the map by World War II. If you're going to fight a war, there are two things that are helpful. Number one, it's good to win. Number two, it's even better if you fight it on the road. The other side suffered, and we were in that position. Now, that was not going to last forever. It just wasn't. The rest of the world got up off the ground and started to compete, and we're going to have to do that. Now, China is out there aggressively competing in a variety of different spheres. But as I pointed out to the Chinese ambassador, they're also cheating a lot. They steal technology right, left, and center. Microsoft has said for a number of years that their largest customer base is in China, but they have absolutely zero revenue because it's all being stolen. So we have to press the idea of an international system. This was the idea behind China PNTR. Bring them into the WTO, get them to play by the rules, and go forward. Obviously, that did not work out as well as anybody would have liked. They are not playing by the rules. But I think it's important also to take a step back at this moment in my spirit of wanting to make sure that we don't go to war with them and understand competition. Once upon a time, the US was the rising power and Great Britain was the #1 power, and we stole a whole lot of stuff from them too. Okay, it's kind of what you do when you're #2. We shouldn't get too overly excited about the fact that somehow China is violating the rules in some sort of unprecedented way. It's still not good. You still got to figure out how to work together to get through it. And also, a lot of the rules could have been artificially set up to benefit us because we were the ones that were in the most power to set up those rules. So I don't have a problem with being reasonable and working with them. But right now, China is not playing by the rules, period. Okay, they are violating them all over the place. We need to work with them to try to figure out how we can get a more rules-based system for this competition. Like I said, we got to be flexible about that. But it's like, two very powerful teams just sort of showed up on the field and they're sort of out there playing by their own sets of rules. At some point, it's like when you were a kid, well, back before everyone had those little phones they play with, we used to go outside and just say, okay, well, let's play a game. We sort of invent it as we went. And you'd make up some rules, but the rules had to apply to everybody. So we knew what was going on. Well, that's kind of what we're going to need to do with China economically and as we build partnerships. We got to stop having this thing every time we do something, they view it as provocative. Every time they do something, we view it as provocative. Having allies competing, it's not necessarily provocative. You're just looking after your interests. Is it fair? And then the last point is, it would be wonderful if in the midst of all of this, we could find some things where we could work with China to address global problems. Bunch of different options here. obviously, the pandemic is a classic example. And we did have some cooperation, which is now under attack given what happened in Wuhan. But I think it is really important that on things like global pandemics, let's find a way to work with China. Again, two most powerful nations in the world. There is a lot that we can work together on climate change that I mentioned earlier. We need both China and the US and other countries as well, but certainly China and the US can be leaders on that. That would be enormously helpful. And then on global development. And this is something, as I was mentioning, as I've been, in Africa and elsewhere, and China's out there and they are helping. They're building soccer stadiums. I was in Niger. They're building a bridge across the river. They're doing a lot on infrastructure. Now, there have been a fair amount of criticism of China in that regard, that they're doing it to sort of leverage power, that they're doing it I forget the phrase, but basically they put people in debt so that they basically own them, and that's happened. But again, as the United States of America, I think we might be a little bit. He who lives in a glass house should not throw stones, as the cliche goes. For those of you who understand development, there are certainly a number of examples across the globe over the course of the last 100 years where the U.S. has done all of that. I do a lot of work in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We propped up Mobutu, and he utterly destroyed the DRC and about 8 or 9 countries that surrounded him over the course of 30 or 40 years. So I think there's the possibility of seeing China's willingness to work in the developing world as a positive to help countries develop, to help countries deal with disease. And I think we should, try to set international standards for that as well. So basically, number one, China's a big damn deal. Okay, we got to figure out how to get along with them would be number 2. And then we have to be able to deter them militarily, strategically compete with them, and cooperate with them where we can. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to your questions is absolutely none of that is going to be easy. In the global environment right now, there is a lot of distrust. There is a lack of communication. So we are going to have to really work hard to do that. I know our national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, was meeting with Chinese leadership, I think today, might have been yesterday. And that sort of thing needs to happen more and more. I know President Biden actually has got a virtual summit set up with President Xi, is going to have that conversation. It's going to be tough, but it starts with dialogue, and it starts with a commitment to trying to get along on this globe so that we can hopefully peacefully work together to make it a better place. And that's what we're trying to do. So actually went on a little bit longer there than I intended, but it's a big subject. So happy to answer your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So you've covered all of the critical dimensions, and we have a whole slew of questions on basically the different facets of what you've been talking about. So I'm going to start with a range of questions which have come up directly with what you were saying regarding military deterrence. There's one general one and then one which is much more specific. I'm going to give them both to you at one shot. So the general one is, given what you've been saying about deterrence, the question is asking how do we deter China but avoid an arms race with China? And then there's a specific set of questions which is linked to your discussion of deterrence, which is about the Wall Street Journal report that the US military personnel were on Taiwan training their counterparts. And there's one of my senior colleagues would like to know if you could share any details, how long has this been going on? What could you tell us? Were you briefed about it in the Armed Services Committee? Just a lot of interest about that specific Wall Street Journal story.
Certainly, and I apologize, by the way. I'm actually in my son's dorm room over in Pullman, ironically, because we were coming over to visit him. He's a freshman over here, so you will probably hear some background noise. Yeah, and I think that first question is what's deterrence and what's an arms race? And I think that that's the distinction I draw is what I drew in my opening remarks is deterrence, dominance is dominance. If you've decided that you get into an arms race more quickly if you're talking about dominance. And this, one of my favorite subjects on this is on I mentioned the nuclear posture review. That's what I'm looking for. We don't need 5,000 nuclear missiles so that we can absolutely obliterate China, 10 different ways and obliterate the planet. We need enough nuclear missiles so that China knows if they try to use theirs, they're going to suffer greatly, which, by the way, has been China's strategy for quite some time. There's a lot of excitement out there that China is, planning on significantly growing their nuclear weapons. Yeah. The most dire scenarios on that say that they're going to get up to like 1,000, like 20 years from now. Well, that's, still a lot less than we actually have are already deployed. So that's how you avoid getting into an arms race is you look at it from a deterrence standpoint. You don't have to have, a 500 ship Navy. You have to have a sufficient military capability to deter China. And you got to know specifically what it is you want to deter them from doing. So I really think that is the difference between deterrence and domination. Now, Taiwan, and I did talk to the ambassador about this, and I said this, I hopefully in a more diplomatic way than it's likely to come out here. We have gotten into more trouble as a globe worrying about what the world was like 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 500 years ago. Okay. Yeah. Once upon a time, Taiwan was part of China. Once upon a time, the Philippines was part of the United States. Okay. Once upon a time, Saddam Hussein decided that Kuwait should be part of Iraq. Yugoslavia tore itself to shreds because I think it was 500 years ago, 600 years ago, they lost the Battle of Kosovo, and the Serbians had apparently never really gotten over that. Get over it. Okay. Whatever happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago, let's not kill more people today as a way to sort of get justice for that. Now, I do not support Taiwan independence. I also do not support getting rid of strategic ambiguity. There's a lot of muttering about that now. Strategic ambiguity is just fine. One country, two systems, okay? Not independent. But we have to discourage China from thinking that they're going to reunite with Taiwan by force. And, I understand where they're coming from. I don't agree with it at all. Taiwan's doing fine. They're doing fine. This isn't 100 years ago. China is not going through a century of humiliation again. They're anything but humiliated. They're a global power. They're doing quite well for themselves. So, let's not get overly concerned about what might have happened 100 years ago. All that said, we do have to be sensitive to it. And I'm really worried about a push towards independence. Now, we've got a couple dozen special forces troops in Taiwan working with partners. We got special forces troops all over the place. We do want to put it in a position where China does not feel that they can reunify with Taiwan by force. We want to deter them from thinking that's the way to go. Now, again, I will aggressively push back on any of my colleagues who are like pushing for Taiwanese independence or, pushing, the idea that we ought to treat Taiwan as a country, because we don't want that conflict. But we should discourage China from the notion that they can reunite it by force. And part of that is making sure Taiwan has, minimum weapon systems and some training. And we've been doing that for decades. It's not anything new. The Chinese belligerence on the subject is very new. And that is what I think we need to discourage them from.
So sort of picking up on that, we have a question from someone who's actually from Singapore, picking up on what your brief discussion of Singapore. And he's asking really about clear rules of engagement, which you discussed. And he wants to know whether this can ever come into reality and whether there's a way to curb what he calls Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific. And what do you think the US would be willing to do, or would the US be willing not to win at every global stage, is what he's asking. So yeah. What's the line on that? I think
it's going to be tough in short term, because China is pushing and China is being very aggressive. As you know, they're moving into the territorial waters of a number of different countries. They've got the conflict with India that they had up on their shared border. China's going to keep pushing and probing. They seem to have sort of, I don't know how to put this exactly, but they're sort of feeling their oats, as it were, as a rising power. And they have not yet, I think, gotten to the point of understanding the responsibilities that come with that, and the fact that they don't have to bully their way into their neighbors to be successful. They're China, okay? They got a great economy, they got a great country, they're going to do fine. They can live in a peaceful world, but that's not where they're at right now. So the best thing we can do, I think, is build partnerships and alliances. I know the whole AUKUS thing got a little bit of criticism. Not the least of which because of an awkward acronym. But that is exactly what I think we need to be doing, is working with partners in the region to make sure that they can protect their own interests, and to show China that it's not just China and the US. It's China and a coalition of partners, certainly in the region, working, Japan, South Korea, India, Philippines, Vietnam, partners in the region who are together on pushing back against the threat that China poses, and then working cooperatively. That's the best thing. The other thing that and this is difficult, we in the US can't be going to places like Singapore and saying you can't deal with China. Okay. And there's a fine line here. We get into this thing with Huawei and arms sales and a bunch of other things. The countries in the region have got to find a way to get along with China. And we have to recognize that, yes, they're going to have a relationship with China. We want to build partnerships and alliances that can help force China to live within the rules, while recognizing that, China's the big kid on the block. You're going to have to deal with them, and we work in partnerships. I think that's the most important thing. That's why I think the Indo-Pacific Defense Initiative is so important. It's about empowering partners in the region, so that China doesn't feel like they have free rein.
Mm-hmm. So switching a little bit, it's linked, but we're getting some pretty strong commentary in the chat. I'm going to give you a chance to respond. There's a sense that of concern about your using the term paranoia, given what some comments are saying. The Chinese government's corruption, disrespect for human rights, and infringement of Taiwan's airspace. So there's kind of a pushback on what you're, on the way in which you characterize that. I wonder if you would like to respond to some of those comments.
Well, I mean, the simple way to respond is with a cliche that you've all heard: just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Okay. And I said that over and over again while I was talking about that, which is, I am not unmindful of the threat from China. Okay. And I will say that again, if that makes people feel better. I am very much aware of, the warplanes that they've been flying over Taiwan, their bellicose language towards Taiwan. As I said, I've seen what they've done in Hong Kong. I've seen the way that they are grabbing up territory from other nations that is, like I said, at best disputed, and in many cases outright belonging to nations that surround them. The fishing rights violations are all over the place and causing devastating problems for a number of countries out there. I do not understate that at all. What I am worried about is the rhetoric that seems to say, basically, to be sort of old West cliche, this globe ain't big enough for the both of us, let's go. Okay, that is the level of paranoia that I'm trying to get everyone to tamp down a little bit, because if we go, the devastating consequences of that are not to be underestimated. For instance, is it really the right move to boycott the upcoming Beijing Olympics. Okay, and that was what there was a lot of rhetoric during our defense bill markup this year, and a lot of amendments pushed to try to attack Beijing in that regard. Is that really what we need to do? Is to irritate them over the Olympics because we want to, prove how awful we think they are? I'm not saying that they're not a threat. I'm saying that to think that the way to deal with that threat is to back them into a corner. Yeah, I don't think we're going to like the way that comes out. So what I'm saying is understand the threat that we have, and balance it. So, the paranoia is not unwarranted. It's just that if we take it to an extreme to basically say China is so bad, so awful, and so terrible, why are you talking to them? Why are you even going to the Olympics? What? I don't think we want the consequences of that conflict. I think we need to find a way to peacefully coexist, or it's going to be really bad. I mean, if we can't peacefully coexist, the first people in line of fire on that are going to be the Taiwanese, and then everybody else in that region. So let's not be too bellicose, beating our chests, saying we can't tolerate these people, we're going to take them out, because we ain't taking them out. At least not unless somebody's got a plan that I haven't seen.
So just to build on that and to flesh out some of the comments, so we can just wrap that up. So in terms of the debate on human rights, for instance, would the U.S. would the U.S. sort of back off from talking about human rights, or talk about it discursively, or just in principle? So where's your line on that in terms of how
we have to talk about human rights? We have to be critical of them. But look, this is something that, it's the heart of darkness. You head in with the best of intentions. Okay. Yeah. And I wish people had a more balanced understanding of this. All across the globe, and Afghanistan is the best example of this. Whatever China is doing, certainly the Taliban as we speak are doing things that are at least as bad. Okay. So we as human beings instinctively want to stop them. And I get that. And I don't think for a second that we should say, as I said in my remarks, it is not okay for China to take over Taiwan. It's not okay what they're doing in Hong Kong. It's not okay what they're doing with the Uyghurs. It's not okay what they're doing with their land grabs. And it's not okay what they're doing with violating fishing rights. Their human rights violations are very real, and they need to be condemned for that. But how far do you want to go? I've dealt with a number of, my friends in the more progressive side of politics who are very concerned about U.S. sanctions. We sanction a lot of countries because we don't like what they're doing. Well, those sanctions have strong effects on the population there. Also, they create greater conflict between us and whoever it is that we are sanctioning. Going back to the Taliban in Afghanistan, if we want to stop the Taliban from doing what they are doing, which is, just horrific for women and girls in particular, and any sort of religious minority, any sort of minority at all, and a whole lot of other people too, then at the end of the day, you got to go fight them. All right. And what we learned over the course of the last 20 years is that's got its limitations too. All right. Now, I would love for the world to all get along, but, at the barrel of a gun, at the barrel of a threat, you've got to factor that in before you just focus on the absolute moral clarity. What that person is doing wrong is wrong. Okay, got it, 100%. How do we get them to change? How do we get them to stop? How do we not make it worse? Okay, how do we not create a conflict that's going to damage even more people? And, what everybody wants to say about why we went into Iraq, why we went into Afghanistan, why we were in Somalia, a lot of it is, okay, we don't like this. We're going to fix it. Okay, we're going to show up. We're going to put these people in their place. I would hope after the last 20 years, we would have a good understanding of the limitations of that sort of, what's the word I'm looking for here, or phrase I'm looking for, moral imperative. The simple self-righteousness of feeling morally superior doesn't necessarily fix a problem. And in many cases, it makes it worse. And that's what I'm trying to avoid. Yes, no, we should never stop talking. China, wants to complain about us talking about human rights. It's like I said, when I sat down with the Chinese ambassador and basically said, you guys should leave Taiwan the hell alone. We should absolutely say things like that. But we better have off ramps. We better have ways to resolve our differences without the conflict ramping up, or the people who are going to get hurt are precisely the people who we think we're speaking up to defend.
So building directly on that, one of my colleagues in the Jackson School is asking a question about the risk of gray zone warfare, and so what kinds of, and he's asking what kinds of non-military options are there to deter the kind of low-level aggressions. And and there are a bunch of questions about different regions. Africa, you mentioned the Pacific. So how does that really take place? Is I think what my colleague is asking. Like, what are the options? Yeah.
It's incredibly complicated, and I could give like an hour and a half long answer walking around the globe here on that one. But let's just start with the concerns with what China's doing in terms of land grabs and by violating fishing rights and other territorial rights. The more allies you have, China has economic needs. They want to do business with these people. They have different things they would want out of the UN. And the more countries that are against them, the more problematic that is. And so if countries say, we've got someone we're going to stand with if you don't follow the rules, that puts pressure on them. Now, it is not the 100% moral clarity pressure that we all seem to crave and that this world so seldom seems to offer, where it's like, you're wrong, I'm calling you out, you're going to stop doing it. All right. It doesn't really work that way. You need to build alliances so that you put more pressure on them to do the right thing instead of the wrong thing. Now, once you get into places, and I think Africa is as good a place as any to analyze this, and I know more about Africa than I do about Latin America. I've spent more time there. So China's trying to build relationships there. They're trying to build relationships. I was in Tunisia. They're there. China obviously dreams of having a military base on the Caribbean, and Tunisia would be as good a place as any. They were also present in Niger and Mali and the DRC, primarily because of the minerals that are available to them. So what the competition looks like is, we're trying to build relationships. They're trying to build relationships. That does not have to become a violent conflict. There, what we think we need to be worried about is to make sure that the people in Africa get something out of the experience, Africa in this case, that they're able to develop, they're able to better deal with their healthcare problems, to grow economically, that they aren't just pawns in a game in the way they were in the Cold War. I think the Cold War is a miserable example of how to compete, in this case with the Soviet Union, in developing countries. We can do better than that. And so I think that's what the competition looks like. But part of that competition is, and this is what's going to get me in a lot of trouble with people, but I'll go ahead and say it because I think it's important in terms of saving the globe here, is we want to imagine a world that doesn't change from our post-World War II dominance. We want to imagine a world where China is not a pure competitor, okay? What I'm telling you is the cost of creating that world, even if we could succeed, which is highly debatable at the moment, but the cost of trying to crush them in that way is really high and really dangerous. So what we have to figure out is how we can compete with them and coexist with them. And a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. It's like USA. We're the dominant power. If we're the dominant power, the world's a better place. We can't let China come up because look at what they're doing to the Uyghurs. Look at what they're doing in Hong Kong. Like, we have to try to guide and steer and push them in a better direction while also being humble about it. As a global power, we certainly have committed our own sins in a number of different places. We want to try to build a place where we as a global power and China as a global power have a better, more peaceful impact on the world. And I don't think we get there by saying we have to dominate China. We have to crush them and push them backwards. We have to deter them and we have to push them in a better, more useful direction. And none of that is easy.
Just kind of wrapping up the discussion on Africa, there's one question which is asking, so on the ground, is there really a shift between, or what is the shift between the Trump policy in Africa regarding China and Biden's policy? So like, how is that kind of shifting, specifically in relationship to Africa, just to kind of complete the discussion?
Wasn't really much of a Trump policy in Africa. he didn't really get there. It sort of carried over. At the end, the Trump policy in Africa was, let's just get the hell out. He pulled the troops out of Somalia. I don't know what it was. Basically, he decided at the end that he was just going to try to pull out wherever he could pull out. He's going to move troops around Europe. It was crazy. I would say at this point that the real debate going on, and this is on the military side, let me just stay there for a moment before shifting to diplomacy, is what sort of presence should we have in Africa? Mm-hmm. Now, as we have had our pivot to Asia and our pivot to great power competition, Mark Esper, who I think has gotten a lot of unfair criticism, I think he actually did a pretty decent job in absolutely impossible circumstances as Secretary of Defense. I used to get calls from him quite frequently in the last year where he would say, all right, I'm probably going to be fired by the end of the day, so this might not be relevant, but I want to let you know what's going on. He was doing his best. And part of what he was doing was saying, all right, if we are in fact going to pivot our focus towards Russia and China, if you're going to ask us to do more, we've got to figure out where we're going to do less. Very logical way of looking at things. And there was a move towards, we don't have a lot of troops in Africa, but could we draw down there in a way that could then free up assets, ISR assets and other things to be elsewhere? I think that has kind of been calmed down a little bit, and we're probably going to hold steady state in Africa. And I think that's sort of the Biden policy going forward. But again, all of this is now under review. Biden team's going to come out with their new policies and everything. So I wouldn't say there's a huge shift between Trump and Biden. I think it's more a matter of trying to figure out how, with a limited presence, we can have a positive influence in the region. And counterterrorism factors in huge. Certainly on the Horn of Africa, but West Africa, Niger, Mali, leading up into Libya as well.
And let me just wrap up, because there's a whole series of questions and more on the economic side and on global warming. But let me just ask you one last question. Going back to your discussion about alliances, which is a core part of what you're talking about, shifting to alliances and sort of non-military responses. But in the Indo-Pacific, are there dangers or risks of alliances getting the US into other kinds of regional quagmires? If you think about, for example, the rapprochement with India, and then, you've talked a lot about the border incursions between China and India, but there's also the India-Pakistan dimension. So that region is very complex. And so is the move towards a more potentially formal alliance with India, does that pose other kinds of complications? So are alliances that simple, when you're talking about all of these different state interests?
Absolutely. I mean, there's two parts to it. I mean, first of all, what China's trying to do, they want us out. They want us gone. They see us as a competitive partner, and they want to do everything they can to force our influence out of the region. That's why they reacted the way they did to the AUKUS agreement and everything else. And I think there we have to be very firm with China and say, look, we're not a threat to you. We're not attacking China. It's never going to happen. We got partners, we got friends in the region, and we got a right to be here. And, you should not see a partnership between the US and India, the US and Australia as a threat. Okay. Unless you're planning on attacking Australia, you don't have anything to worry about. And if you are planning on attacking Australia, well, then that's your problem. And I think we need to be very firm about that. Now, the second piece of your question is there's also kinds of all other things going on. You mentioned Pakistan and India. There's, the Philippines. We are not in love with Duterte's human rights record. His human rights record is appalling. On the other hand, do we want to push the Philippines into the arms of China by cutting them off? And I think, knock on wood, it sounds like Duterte is actually not going to run again next year. But we'll see if that actually pans out. So yes, absolutely. When we're trying to build those partnerships, there's going to be complications. This is a whole nother subject. But when it comes to India and Pakistan, I wish we had a better relationship with Pakistan, but I think we definitely need to be looking at our strategic interests there as much more, aligned with India right now. And historically, that has not been the case. Historically, we had, had the relationship with Pakistan because India had, I forget the phrase, they were basically being neutral in the whole Cold War thing. But I think where we're at right now, strengthening the relationship with India is vastly more important to our interests.
Okay, thank you for that. So I wanted to shift a little bit because there's a quite a few questions, which are more about economic competition, which is a key part of your opening remarks as well. And as I don't need to tell you, that also then sort of connects to domestic politics and sort of domestic interests when it comes to labor. So I think one set of questions is really asking you about the question of rules and sort of, you mentioned, for example, in your opening comments that the entry into the World Trade Organization didn't really work in terms of getting China to obey all the rules. So in what ways, what are the options for the US to really engage in that kind of rule setting?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to go a long way for this one, so apologize for this in advance. But the fundamental problem in the US right now is economic inequality. And the fact that wealth has become so concentrated in the hands of the few. And I'm sure you're going to have economics professors who are going to choke a little bit on my quick summary here, but just a point of getting to where we're at. Essentially, over the course of the last 50 years, a couple things happened, three that were most important. One is what I referenced earlier, global competition. And there was no stopping global competition. Well, I mean, the only way we could stop it is if we were going to, try to be the Roman Empire and dominate everybody militarily forever. And that just wasn't going to happen. The rest of the world was going to compete. And that competition was going to hurt manufacturers and lower wage workers as the competition spread throughout the globe. The second thing is technology, obviously. And technology, depending on the technology, you can be a winner or a loser. Maybe it opens up an opportunity for you, or maybe it takes away your job. Those two trends really drove inequality in the last 50 years. Those two, frankly, there wasn't a heck of a lot we could do about. The third trend, however, was something that we absolutely could and can still do something about. And that trend is towards rewarding shareholders, investors, and executives to absolutely ungodly levels while driving down the wages for everybody else. That is completely unnecessary. There is no reason on earth where shareholder value has to become, the be all and end all of human existence. And when you look at, where we live in the Pacific Northwest, you can see all the tech money and all the shareholder money that's being spread around there. And then you create, a couple situations. First of all, in order to get those shares up, part of what they try to do is drive the wages down and drive the benefits down of the workers. This is why, jobs become contractor jobs instead of employees' jobs. This is why Amazon had their charming policy of figuring out that once employees have been there for 3 years, they get more expensive and they tend to whine more. So let's drive them out before they get to that 3-year mark. It's a $2 trillion company. Could they really not afford to actually take care of workers for a longer period of time? And it's not just Amazon. It's a whole lot of companies that shareholder, and screw the worker, okay? And what that's done is it's created this incredible economic inequality. People can't afford to live in King County anymore. It's, my father bought a house, 1971, $15,000. He was a baggage handler. Whatever he was getting paid in 1971, you can go up to what a baggage handler is getting paid now, and you can see that house, I don't know how you would say 25 times as much. It's 25 times as expensive now. Those wages did not keep up, okay? And what that did is it generated a whole lot of economic insecurity and a whole lot of anger. And there are some simple solutions to that. One is to change the corporate charters out there so that you don't have shareholder value absolutely crushing every other value in the world. Put pressure on corporations to actually balance that out. Two is this torturous, painful, horribly politically botched infrastructure conversation that we're having, which is you've got to give people some sort of a social safety net in this much more competitive world that we live in, which means you have to get in. Don't talk to me about numbers. I don't give a damn about the numbers. We're talking about childcare. We're talking about the idea that in a difficult economic environment, if you've got to get a job and take care of your child, access to childcare is pretty close to life or death. And going forward, I'm talking about family leave. So if you have a healthcare emergency within your family, you don't automatically lose your job and then you can't afford any place to live. The specifics that are in that proposal that are going to give people economic security in a competitive, rapidly changing world are absolutely crucial. So if we made those policy changes, we could better compete with China. Okay, forget for the moment what rules they're following, what rules they're not following. You know, we're doing just fine if you look at the top 20% in this country. We fret about, oh my God, China's killing us. Bullshit. Sorry. You know, I mean, how much money do you want? Okay. I mean, my God, drive through Bellevue, you know, drive through Seattle. I mean, really? We're getting killed? Doesn't look like we're getting killed. The people who are getting killed are the people in the industrial Midwest, in industrial towns, in manufacturing towns, and factory towns. And they're not just getting killed because of China. They're getting killed because of the way we set up the policies, the way we're paying executives, the way we're paying shareholders, and the way we're not giving them the basic economic benefits that every other Western industrialized country in the world gives. And we can fix that irrespective of what the hell's going on with the WTO. Okay, so got that off my chest. It's really important policy point that we blow past on too many occasions. As far as the other point, like I said, you know, we could first of all be a little bit more humble about this. When we were coming up, like China was coming up, we were cheating too. Okay. You know, it's not somehow something that's unique to China and they're unfair and it's terrible and it's awful and it's horrible. And oh my gosh, how can you possibly be doing this? It's still wrong. It still needs to be fixed and we still need to work with them. But if we can work with them from a slightly better position, having better domestic policies. Sorry, I forgot to get a cup of water before I started this. Then that would help. The other part of it is, now I know we got a lot of criticism for bringing China into the WTO and all of that. I don't really think there was a lot better option there. It's not like China was going to play by the rules if they were outside of the WTO or that they weren't going to find a way to take advantage of things. I think we have to impress upon them, give us at least a little bit here. And that's the argument I had with the Chinese ambassador. I said, you want us to stop being provocative? Stop stealing our stuff. Okay. You know, at least live within some of it. And I think we got to continue to press that case. And I'll come back to where I've been multiple times during this conversation, alliances and partnerships. If it's the US trying to bang on China about this, well, okay. But if it's the US and several dozen other major countries, all trying to put that pressure on them, that changes the equation. And also, if our workers are feeling better about getting their fair share of the pie, they'll give us a lot more leeway to promote American companies and to move forward on that. But the raw deal that we've given to American workers over the course of the last 50 years has really undercut our ability to be united as a country in competing economically.
No, so thank you for that. There's a lot of important points that you make, but let me just add some questions which are pushing you a little bit, if you don't mind.
Oh,
so,
that's what this is supposed to be about. Don't apologize for that.
Yeah,
I hate this damn thing where everyone's like, oh, I don't want to offend you. It's, like, it's a big world.
Right.
People get offended. It's perfectly okay.
All right, so then let me ask you pointedly then. So some of the questions, and I'll expand a little bit on my own, are asking whether you could really think of economics purely as a domestic policy issue in the way in which you're framing it, because aren't there ways in which, for example, supply chains make, one question is asking, make the United States more vulnerable?
If I could, so if I gave the impression that I'm thinking of economic policy as purely domestic, then I misspoke. I'm saying that the domestic aspect of our economic policy has been so horrific to make the whole thing very difficult to deal with. Absolutely, it's global and international. It's trade is very international, but the domestic part of it, we have done so horribly wrong that it makes the rest of it very difficult to. I mean, the rest of it isn't going to make up for those horrible domestic policy mistakes.
Okay, so then let me frame it a different way. So is there a way in which the US also has a dependence on China? Given
Absolutely.
China's investment in the financial markets, given the way in which supply chains are organized, and how does that limit what the US can do when it's trying to incentivize, rules, etc.?
Yeah, the short answer to that is I don't really know. My suspicion is that it's pretty much even. It's pretty much a push in the following sense. A lot of people focus on the fact that we are dependent upon China to lend us money. And that's very true. I don't know what the number's at, but it's got to be in multi-trillions of dollars by now that we owe China. And certainly that makes us dependent upon them. But on the other hand, I kind of figure China wants the money back. It's the old cliche, and I don't know what the updated numbers figures were be here. You know, if you owe the bank $100,000, the bank owns you. If you owe the bank 10 million, you own the bank. So my sense is that in terms of that whole dependency thing, you know, both sides are dependent upon each other. Now, one thing that I have learned in dealing with human beings for a long time is our ability to cut off our nose to spite our face is not to be underestimated. So the mere fact that it would be crazy for either side, you know, we need China to keep lending us money. They need us to keep buying their stuff and paying them back. You know, I mean, we can get angry and they can get angry and we can blow the whole thing up. But my sense is they're as dependent upon us as we are dependent upon them. You know, I could be wrong about that. Maybe the dollar figure didn't play, but it just seems to me when you think of all this, you know, China's economy, 1.4 billion people they got to feed. They need us to buy that stuff, and they need us to keep paying off those notes. So my sense is that is somewhat mutual. Where we're in a bad place is in the way that they are competing right now, in the way that they are stealing technology and undercutting the American workforce. And, you know, a lot of the basic rules within the WTO, the idea that you shouldn't be able to below cost sell, you know, the idea that you have to treat all products, you know, equally, regardless of where they're coming from. They're cheating on 1,000 different levels there. You know, that definitely are creating an unfair competitive environment. And certainly we suffer from it, but I think as importantly, a lot of developing nations that are having to compete with China are suffering from it too. So yeah, we should push them on that. And that stuff is hugely important. Don't misunderstand me. But I'm saying, don't forget about the domestic stuff. I've had businesses and corporations for 25 years asking me, 25 years, 24 years, you know, what can I do to make it easier for Democrats to support trade policy? And I've told them the same thing for 24 years. Treat your workers better. Because when the day comes that a Boeing worker and a manufacturing worker in our country thinks that he or she is going to benefit as much as the corporation from that trade deal, then we're going to be fine. But as long as you keep screwing them, as long as you keep taking an unfair share of that pie and not giving workers their fair share, they're not signing up for that deal. No corporation has ever listened to me on that point. They always come back to me and say, well, you don't understand. Here's why trade is important. We have to have access to markets in order to grow, and we can't compete. I said, got it. Know all that. But you're still paying your workers, you're still cutting their healthcare benefits and giving, you know, my personal favorite example, because I fly United Airlines, is Jeff Smisek, who apparently violated some law and screwed up the whole company terribly when Continental and United merged. And, you know, they, you know, got rid of the pensions and undercut, you know, everything for the company. And so they fired him and they gave him $30 million. Someday I want to be fired like that. You know, I mean, that'd be a great life. Yeah. And how do you do that? And come to me and say, well, you know, why don't people understand international competition and how trade works? You know, I don't know if they understand it or not, but they know they're getting screwed. And I know that corporations and powerful people in economic circles can change that.
Yeah, thank you for that. So let me just ask you one more question on this, and then I'll move on to there's some questions about climate change and cooperation. Or maybe I'll just move on, because maybe I'll shift because there's a number of questions popping up. So let me just shift to the question of global cooperation. We have a question from one of my senior colleagues about what kinds of concessions you think the U.S. should make in order to gain China's acceptance of a response to global warming. So what kinds of frameworks do you think could be developed that could spur cooperation around global issues like climate change that could take us in a better direction?
Yeah, the honest answer there is I'm not an expert in that area. I don't really know the ins and outs of it. I know it's really difficult just because two large growing economies very dependent upon fossil fuels. How do we get them off of that? And also there is a lot of competition, even in the sort of the green energy field, as we're trying to, you know, in solar and wind and a bunch of other technologies. I mean, what I'd try to do if I was in that space is, it seems to me like there's a lot to go around here. You know, we've got 7 point whatever billion people on the globe who are going to need energy. And when you're developing battery technology, when you're developing new fuel sources like hydrogen and wind and solar and everything else, you know, I would look for ways to form partnerships. And it's tough. I mean, because one of the examples that's coming to mind is, you know, is one that's probably going to set some people off, but, you know, nuclear power. You know, what is the role of nuclear power in this? Because, you know, I understand you got to do something with the waste and the dangers and risks and all of that, but it is an abundant, clean burning, you know, source of fuel if you can develop it. Well, Bill Gates had a company that was developing a new reactor, and there was a partnership with China, but we, you know, we killed that partnership because of, well, sorry, I don't use paranoia to mean that you're wrong. Okay, you know, paranoia is frequently justified, but because of our, shall we say, concerns about China and what they might do, they, you know, we didn't give approval for that partnership to go forward. I would look for ways to find partnerships so that it isn't always a zero-sum game. Like China's making, you know, solar cells now, and we got to figure out how to, if there was a way to do partnerships, and I know there are a number of partnerships between Chinese firms and US firms. I think we need to dare to try and do that and take advantage of their expertise and our expertise to try to build partnerships, because technology is the way we're going to find our way out of this. It's the only answer to ending our dependency on fossil fuels. And China has every little bit as big interest in doing that as we do. So we should look for those types of partnerships, but I don't know the specifics of what that would look like.
So I guess building on this idea of spaces of cooperation, there are some questions coming from students, international students, who are one person asking about international students as a particular a set of a group that can sort of negotiate or mediate between these different relationships. But at the same time, as you know, Chinese students have increasingly come under sort of surveillance, or sort of have been sort of represented as sort of threatening, and also Chinese researchers and international faculty as well. And the question is asking for your response or thoughts about that.
Yeah, and I do. There's certainly a risk. But I think the risk of cutting off those relationships is far greater than the risk of having, you know, a few spies running around the country. And I am deeply concerned, and this is another area where that paranoia I keep referencing is played out. You know, certainly it's international students, but I've seen it with Chinese Americans. I've seen it with, you know, forgive me, Americans who happen to be of Chinese descent. They have a much tougher time getting jobs within, you know, the IC. Or within the Department of Defense. I don't think that helps us. You know, and when you're looking at a lot of the student exchange programs that people are, you know, trying to shut down, there was the whole controversy over the Confucius Institute programs. Look, we spy on them, they spy on us. You know, and there's a whole lot of people who don't take my same approach to this. It's like, that's not exactly news, okay? And, you know, I just worry that in cutting off that sort of cultural exchange, we just ramp up the tensions higher, and we miss the opportunity to build relationships that can serve us down the road. And dumb understand me about that. I'm not naive. I'm aware that, you know, in doing that, you know, we probably in some ways make it easier for China to spy on us, but it's like at the margins, and that's going to happen anyway. So why don't we do this? Why don't we actually have a decent intelligence operation that can figure out who actually is spying on us, as opposed to treating everyone like they are, even when they aren't. And I just think it's really damaging right now. And it's one of the things where, again, I'm somewhat outnumbered in Congress, but I don't want our paranoia to impede those relationships.
And then sort of just wrapping up that this whole series of questions, still going back to the issue of whether there can be a set of global rules that can incentivize China to sort of buy into. And I think some of the questions are also pushing to ask you whether China may not be setting its own set of rules, global rules, because China itself is developing alliances. And is it so self-evident that the global rules are going to be defined by the US and its allies? Or
sorry.
Yeah.
That was kind of what I was talking about earlier with my analogy of, you know, kids going out and setting up the rules. One team doesn't set the rules, and that's why I've been talking about trying to understand and work in cooperation and understand where we're at, and why I cite the history of some of the things that we've done in the past. I think we've got to be open and flexible about the fact that no, we're not going to dictate the rules. And let's be honest about it. I don't have an example off the top of my head. I'll research it the next time I have this conversation, because I'm quite certain there are examples out there. But there were probably a lot of things, a lot of rules that were set up because of our dominance in the world that were set up to our advantage. And is that really a rule? Or is it just, sorry, it's a rule. Is it really a fair rule, or is it just called the fair rule because it happens to benefit us? Sorry, I keep coming back to sports analogies. It's like, if you're going up against a basketball team that shoots threes better than you go, you know what, we're going to eliminate 3-point line. There's only going to be 2-point shots for everybody. Okay, a whole bunch of different ways to game the system to get your advantage. And I personally feel that if we're going to work with China and get to that set of rules, we got to look at that. Now, we have to some degree done that. I mean, within the WTO, there's the whole developed nations versus developing nations, and the rules I have to pay attention to, and then thousands of different other things that I'm unaware of and don't know the details of. But yeah, I mean, if you're going to get to an accommodation, it can't all be on our terms. I completely agree with that.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess, we only have a little bit of time left. So I guess the last set of questions are more forward looking. And one question is asking what you expect to come out of the virtual summit between Biden and President Xi.
Well, it's hard to say. And it certainly is going to be a lot of subtlety and everything's back. But if I was to give you sort of a binary thing, it can go one of two ways. One, you can come out of it and say, it's good that we're talking. We got a long way to go. Our relationship is at a very fraught point, but we just wanted to start the dialogue because of all the reasons that I've said already, going forward. Or, look, I think China has become very rhetorically belligerent of late. Back to my, when I was at the Shangri-La Dialogues 2 years ago, the Chinese defense minister spoke, and basically it was a lecture about how horrible the US has been. It was this, walking through the history of slavery and every wrong thing that the US has ever done. It was a very confrontational, approach. And I've never spoken with Xi. Obviously, I've read about him and seen him. Probably a ton of people on this call who know better than I how he would likely handle that. I could see it going sideways into sort of a little bit of a belligerent back and forth about who's provoking whom, and who's cheating more. So that would be the way I say it. What I expect is the first thing that I said, is that there probably won't be anything terribly concrete. Now, the one thing that we haven't talked about, I'm sorry, I should divide that up front, is the trade war that's going on, and what exactly that is benefiting. I can also see potentially the positive step coming out of that, some sort of an agreement, because President Trump never had a plan on this. Mm-hmm. It was just, I'm going to punch China just to show people that I'm tough. And keep those tariffs in place. And every 6 months, the Trump administration would announce, we've got a deal. China has agreed to blah, 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 blah. And because of pressure, and then you'd look at it and go, yeah, no, that's not a deal. I mean, all China's saying is they're going to keep buying some of our stuff, which they were doing already. So is there an offer on that conflict? So that's what I could hope would come out. So it could go sideways. It could become sort of you're terrible. No, you're worse. It could just be, hey, we talked, we'll talk again, sort of like a mediocre first date. But we'll try it again at some point. Or, best case scenario, they do get into some economic conversations where potentially we can get a deal and reduce that trade war in a way that's mutually beneficial.
Thank you for that. And so I guess the last set of questions are asking you to step back a little bit and sort of asking you more generally, as you think about the US-China relationship, what gives you most hope and what is of most concern to you? I think many of us also read some of the reports in the presidential transition, some of the close calls which were being avoided, with backdoor communication. So it seems like perceptions and threats and narratives can produce a lot of uncertainty. So from your perspective, given your sort of overarching view of everything, where do you see real hope and where do you see real concern?
I'll give you 3 points. I mean, I guess the first one would fall into the sort of awkward real hope sort of side. You cannot underestimate the degree to which having a president who was at best as unpredictable and at worst as unstable as Donald Trump had on the world, A, and B, how completely unusual that is. All right. You know, and I don't think there was ever any huge danger here, but the way President Trump just sort of flitted all over the place and challenged every single norm of our democratic society on a routine basis. And this is another reason why I have the respect I have for Mark Esper and certainly for Chairman Milley, who I worked very closely with throughout this whole process, is they both continued to serve their commander in chief and at the same time tried to make sure that he didn't cause too much damage. And if you think that's easy, ponder it for a minute or two. So that whole thing was, I think, generated more by what I, knock on wood, will hope is the unique chaos that was generated in the last 6 months of the Trump administration. That chaos is unique. I guess what I should say is that chaos will not be repeated at any point. Hopefully that'll be the case. As far as, I'll start with what I'm most pessimistic about. What I'm most pessimistic about is the inability of human beings to realize the necessity of trying to get along with each other. We seem to have gotten really good at figuring out what we and our groups want and what we and our groups seem to think that we absolutely deserve to have. And we've lost the skill set of, we all want to get along in the world. We all want to figure out, how not just we can get what we want, but the other person can get what he wants or she wants, so that we don't, blow the whole thing up. And human beings just seem to be increasingly strident, increasingly focused on narrow individual demands and less focused on peace and stability. And that's whether you're talking about a neighborhood association or global powers. We need some better diplomats and a better recognition of what we have in common as humanity, as opposed to so obsessively focusing on our own particular individual group and how we have been wronged and how we must fix those wrongs. That seems to be a general theme growing up globally. And we've seen it in the drift towards autocratic government in a number of different countries. I guess ultimately, if I had to say what gives me hope, I would say, first of all, there are a lot of very experienced international diplomats in the Biden administration. And I know a lot of people were concerned about what happened in Afghanistan, but they were dealt an impossible hand there. It was a policy that President Biden was opposed to when he was vice president. He didn't want us to stay there 11 years ago. So getting out of that was going to be very difficult. But I think they have a lot of experience. They know how to work with international powers to get along. And then the other thing is, in the case of the US and China, it really can't be too much more clear how mutually dependent we are. There is just a lot to lose. Now, I know Thomas Friedman was way crazy too optimistic 20 some odd years ago when he said that no two countries that both have McDonald's have ever gone to war. I think he underestimated the ability of countries to still find things that were different enough about them to fight. But I still believe that at the end of the day, mutual interest is a huge driver here. And it's a global economy. We stop, China stops, we both lose. It is very difficult for China to figure out a way to hurt us that doesn't also hurt them, and vice versa. And if we really take a step back and think through it clearly, I think we will recognize that.
So let me just ask you one final question, and you've been very patient, so I'll make this my last one. Since you raised the question of Afghanistan, one of the narratives which is out there is that withdrawing from Afghanistan sort of frees up the US to focus more on China. But the Middle East and Afghanistan in particular has a way of pulling the US back. What is your response? And also, what is China's perception of what happened in Afghanistan with the United States? And how does that play into this relationship?
Yeah, it's a really complicated question. My son did warn me, by the way, that it would be noisy in the background when I was here. It was really rather quiet until we got to the 5 o'clock point. So, what the globe's perception of, well, on the free us up question, I mean, think of it this way, at the height of our conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had over 200,000 troops committed to those two countries. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of resources. We don't have that anymore. So without question, that does free up some assets and it frees up some revenue to better look for deterrence elsewhere. I think that's just an absolute fact. And while, yes, it doesn't mean that we can stop thinking about South Asia and the Middle East, we have fewer assets committed there and it's less costly and less expensive. We're not shutting down, the Middle East division at the National Security Council or DOD. We're still going to be paying attention to it. We're still going to have to deal with it, but we're not going to have over 200,000 troops and all the costs that come with that committed to the region. And I think that does help us a little bit. As far as the way the rest of the world looks at it, everyone's, I don't know, they're trying to advance their own. I'm sure China's going to say, oh, we knew the US was weak. They're a fading power. They can blow. And I got in this discussion with some European Parliament members who were, upset, shall we say, at our leaving. And what is this going to say about US commitment? And I got very specific about it. I was in Eastern Europe for 10 days a little while back. I said, look, the United States of America spent 20 years, almost 3,000 lives, tens of thousands wounded, north of $2 trillion, trying to build a better government in Afghanistan so that the people of Afghanistan could have a better life. Okay. Now, we were also interested in our counterterrorism interests. So I'm not saying we did it for any sort of like purely noble purpose, but we did it. And we did it for 20 years and at that cost. Can you think of another nation in the history of the globe that would have stuck with something for that long? Okay. We did not succeed. We did not succeed because we were never going to be able to succeed in the mission that we set out. Sadly, there was not a reasonable alternative to the Taliban to be set up. Now we're going to look at this. Maybe there was something we could do. We could have made a different set of decisions. I don't know. But I think our adversaries are going to try to use this against us as evidence that we won't stick to a commitment. I don't think that's going to last very long, A, because it's obvious the commitment that we made, and B, I think people will understand the challenges that existed there. So I don't really think that Afghanistan is going to have a lasting impact on our international credibility. What will have a lasting impact on our international credibility is whether or not we make it clear that we learned the lessons of that we've learned that the idea that we can simply show up with our military might and force our will on other places is an idea that we now understand is just not going to happen and is not the right way to play. It's going to depend a lot on what we do going forward. Do we do the diplomacy and the relationships and the development? Do we re-engage in the world in a positive way? I think that's going to have a greater impact on that, even while our adversaries will use it as some sort of evidence of our decline.
Well, thank you so much for your patience, for just the breadth and depth which you gave us on all of these issues. We're basically a few minutes out of time, so I'm going to just end the program with my warmest thanks, and hope to have you in the Jackson School again.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Take care, and thank you to the audience as well.